All right, today we're going to be talking about Michel Houllebecq's The Map and the Territory, translated by Gavin, which sometimes you read a book and it's really less about the book itself and more about your journey with the book. And for such a little book, this was really quite a fascinating is a good word, maybe, experience with this book because, wow, there's like so much to talk about. I mean, for starters, this is the third book by Houllebecq that I've read, and I remember it's been a while. I read Atomized and I liked parts of it. It's been a really, really long time, like really long. So I don't remember it very well. But I remember the big thing that I remember taking away from it was this idea that in an age of, and this is something I still believe to this day, you kind of had the pre-modernist age, which was like the era of God, and then I think of the modernist age as the era of believing in science and that science was going to solve everything. And then post-World War I and really, really hard post-World War II, we enter the postmodernist age, where we don't really believe in a science or a God. And to my perspective and way of looking at things, we're all kind of wandering a bit lost. And certainly Atomized, while I wasn't fully formed there yet, made me appreciate that sort of in the absence of spiritualism in a religious sense, that there needs to be something that fills that similar void, that spiritual desire in humanity. It doesn't have to necessarily be religion, but there is a certain kind of spiritual desire, be it through like meditation or sex or New Age or whatever. Like there are various ways that people go about filling it, but that there needs to be some sort of greater purpose or something more to life than just the rational, which, like, not being able to remember much about the book itself, it's difficult to say, was it a good book or not? But I remember coming away with it with thoughts like that, so I definitely had an appreciation for it. But then I moved on to Whatever a few years ago, and it was just whatever. Like, I just did not care one way or the other. And the thing with Houllebecq, he has kind of a reputation for being very conservative. I'm not totally up to date with what it is that he did exactly. I know that one of his books was very anti-Palestine, and he's very anti-Palestine, and I know he's very right-wing, which was sort of a challenge, one of the challenges, rather, because there were several, and we're going to go through them all. But the first major challenge for me reading this book was, again, trying to separate Houllebecq, the writer, from his work, because I remember reading something that he said that most people have already made up their mind about my work without ever even having read it, which is a type of thought process that, while there is context, is something that I very much try to push against. While it is very contextual, broadly, in a broad context, I believe in separation of art and artist. So in that sense, when you don't really know much about the writer except all these controversies, it can be very hard to read their work. But I wanted to really try to and see, is his work super right-wing or not? But one of the things that this led to was when I was reading about this particular work, there was a certain prize. I don't think it's that the book itself won, but I think it's one of the other ones that Houllebecq won. But anyway, it was called the, hold on one sec here, the Prix Renaudet, I believe is how it's pronounced. And that led me to, in the Wikipedia page, it says, in 2013, winning the Prix Renaudet essay revived the career of Gabriel Matzneff. His career later collapsed in 2020 as his pedophilia, long known and defended by his literary peers, including the Renaudet jurors, became more widely known through the report of one of his victims, Vanessa Springora, which led me kind of down a rabbit hole there, which really was eye-opening. And when I talked about it with one of my friends, one who lives in Finland, and when I brought it up with my mother, who studied French for several years, neither one of them were really surprised by this. And to me, it was kind of a huge surprise. I was like, oh my God, like, how can there be somebody who wrote books about pedophilia and was defended within the French literary establishment? You know, how did they get away with it, much less be defended by it? And it made me really, like, have to face the fact that I don't know shit about France, which I already, you know, could accept. And one of the struggles that I had with this book was the fact that it's labeled as a satire and mentions the names of many, many figures and places and whatnot that I just don't know, and I have no context for knowing. I only know the very broad strokes of French history, and very little at that. So that aspect of the book was lost on me. But then to just be confronted with this, to realize that this was happening in 1990 up to 2010 and 2020 even, it was just like, wow. Phrases like conservative or liberal are really, really relative, to the point where if people say Houllebecq is a conservative, what does that mean? One of his friends mentioned in the book, who I looked up, is another writer, and the writer is mentioned as liberal. And it's like, okay, then I learned that he was actually part of the French Communist Party, which, as an American, is just like, that's not what would be in America thought of as liberal. That's like something completely different. And I think it would probably be the same in the UK, but I can't say for certain. But suffice to say, it was certainly made me realize that these terms that are used to describe Houllebecq are based on French context, of which I know nothing. And I don't know much about French society. I don't know much about the French art scene. This was just a whole metric shit ton of I don't know. And then also, while I'm reading the book, trying to separate out my ignorance of the French world and my feelings, or what I know, what limited bit I do know about Houllebecq, you have the fact that Houllebecq writes himself as a character. And going off the back of the book, I was like, this could be pretty funny, pretty amusing. It makes it sound like it's going to be a big comedic thing. And again, my lack of understanding means that whether it's satire or not, I don't know. A lot of it is based very much on his own life. And there are moments where he does things that seem like it's being playful. For example, he'll regularly describe himself as, author of Atomized, or the author of Platform. And not just him, but one of his other writer friends he'll describe as like the author of the French novel. And sometimes he'll describe himself very disparagingly. But then at other times he'll, mention like he had 9 former lovers, all of which still think of him very fondly. And it's like, okay, are you being funny here, or are you stroking your own ego? And especially when there's one part where they're talking about sort of political figures, big political I don't know if it would be right to call him a political philosopher, or just a political idealist, political reformer, where, again, Houllebecq is writing a story about Houllebecq, talking about this political reformer as this great guy, at which point it's like, is it a great guy, or did the author literally just write himself talking about how great a guy this is? So there's that element that makes it made it really, really difficult to read. And then there's also the fact that being about a photographist and a painter, when they talk about going to the galleries or stuff like that, it calls to mind very much Killing Commendatore and The School of Night, which, granted, both of which came after this book. This book was released in 2010. Nonetheless, really was just another thing. It's difficult to read and focus on one book while you're constantly reading and while you're constantly being reminded of other books. And you add all this together, and it was just blanket impossible to read this book as just its own thing on its own terms. Which really, given the satire and the observations contained within, I don't think it was really possible to ever do in the first place. a satire can never stand on its own because it exists in reference to something else. But on the flip side, it was just astronomically more challenging this time. But the reason that I never gave up and that I continued going through it was because I still believed that the only way that I was ever going to come to a conclusion was to push my way through and ultimately get through this milieu and finally at the end confront that, how did I feel on the book overall? And from there, I'll be able to judge, my feelings on it. Because I've mentioned in the past, like, okay, I've read 2 Houllebecq books and I'm kind of in the middle, but 3 usually cinches it. And the unfortunate reality is, at the end here, is this is such a conflicting book with so much going on, and I feel like I understood so little about it that I am still left feeling like I don't really know much one way or the other with Houllebecq overall. So to get into what the book is about so that I can then get to a recommendation, that's also another thing that I think makes it really, really challenging, is if you read the back of the book, the back of the book, artist Jed Martin emerges from a 10-year hiatus with good news. It has nothing to do with his broken boiler, the approach of another lamentably awkward Christmas dinner with his father, or the memory of his doomed love affair with the beautiful Olga. It is that, for his new exhibition, he has secured the involvement of none other than celebrated novelist Michel Houllebecq. The exhibition brings Jed new levels of global fame, but his boiler is still broken, his ailing father flirts with oblivion, and worst of all, he is contacted by an inspector requiring his help solving an unspeakable, atrocious, and gruesome crime involving none other than the celebrated novelist Michel Houllebecq. And while it is true that those things kind of happen, it definitely paints the conflict with Houllebecq as being the main focal point of the book. But in fact, that incident with Houllebecq doesn't occur until 3/4 of the way through the book, which leaves a lot of the what is the book actually about really being just kind of Jed Martin being lonely and his sort of looks on art. And this is where, in my ignorance, when the kind of way that the impression that I get, and again, this is my total ignorance, I'm not saying this as any kind of factual thing, but the impression that I get is that Jed is in some way a parallel to Houllebecq, a fictional either manifestation of Houllebecq or a mirror to Houllebecq, because Jed mentions numerous times connections with this fictional version of Houllebecq, and that they might be able to be friends with each other, and feels very attached to him until the crime does ultimately happen. And in that sense, it would certainly contextualize some of the conflicting nature between Jed and his father, and Jed's ultimate course through life, which I don't want to get too much into spoilers right here, right now, because this gets into the recommendation part of my review. To whom would I recommend this to? And I feel like you would definitely have to be someone who knows something about Houllebecq, knows something about Paris and French politics and French society way more than I do. I genuinely feel like some kind of fundamental knowledge of these things is necessary to understanding this book, which was not what I got from Whatever, and it's not what I got from Atomized or The Elementary Particles. It was different in the UK or the US. Which was really surprising to me, but that just, it is what it is. Like I said, I have never, literally never read a book with this many outside influences coming in and getting in the way of my reading. So I think it doesn't feel like there's much there if you don't have that awareness, and you just kind of, I personally feel need it. But if you do have it, then, kind of getting into the pros and cons, it was really, really nice after going from Honeybees and Distant Thunder with its really, really short paragraphs that, constantly broke it up and reiterated certain thoughts. And then Chinaman, where it had really, really short chapters. It still has short chapters, but to get into some prose that was nice and long and flowing, had a very nice feel about it, that didn't constantly put things into every single line to emphasize points really strongly, to just kind of sit back, more mature, more letting you take it in at its own pace. Nice style of prose to it that I greatly missed from the last two books that I've read. And I do think that a lot of the observations are interesting, but again, this comes back to, I don't know enough about the state of either the politics in France or the politics of Houllebecq himself to really get into whether they're right or wrong. So, for instance, there's a part in the story where his father is talking about euthanasia, and the only reason that I know that this is a really huge point to Houllebecq is from the Wikipedia article that I was kind of browsing through, where it says that he's hugely against human euthanasia and views it as this like really, really great evil, which kind of makes its portrayal in the book feel a bit less like, it's difficult to say, because you can totally read it, I think, as Jed being an overreactive dick about the idea of his father going through with this idea of human euthanasia, of not wanting to live. But at the same time, it is described as a sort of vile and despicable thing, and it depends on whether or not you want to take that as it describing Jed's view, or as the narrator describing it that way, and consequently it's Houllebecq describing it that way, which is one of those things that just fundamentally is why I like first-person narratives, because it's a lot easier to just assume that you're looking at things from the point of view of the character, and it gives you more of that ground as the reader to agree or disagree, because it's not so much coming from a voice of God, omniscient narrator, which in this case it is third-person omniscient. Which it just kind of conflicts, generates some conflict there between what is Houllebecq saying versus what is the story saying. And I come back to, Houllebecq saying people have already made up their mind about my work before they've already read it, and me trying to be fair to the work itself and what it's actually saying versus what I think it's saying, knowing how Houllebecq feels. But even with that in mind, I think that there's still some good stuff here that's really interestingly told about, that doesn't have to do with the broader nature of French and French society, about the relationship between art and people, the relationship between people and people, and how things kind of decay and change over time, how legacies are kind of built and how the legacies kind of steadily decay. And at the end of the day, what once seemed important or even inevitable eventually just becomes kind of nothing. But it's portrayed in a very interesting way, because I don't get the sense that Houllebecq is much of a sentimentalist, which it's just interesting to me. Like, I generally, most writers tend to be more left-leaning. Most artists tend to be typically more left-leaning, and I tend to consume more left-leaning stuff. So it's really interesting every once in a while to read right-leaning, or in this case, ostensibly very right, individual, where even if I don't necessarily agree with all of their views and all of their conclusions, to just see the difference in the way that they present those views, that there's a lot more reliance on a sort of culture tradition, statistical figures, and the language tends to be much harsher. It's more of a critical language than it is necessarily an appeal to pathos type thing, which I find quite interesting. If I'm sort of describing that well, again, it's very difficult for me to kind of capture that feeling accurately. So that's what I still think that there's value there. I think that some of the things that are being said are interesting, and certainly the rabbit hole that I went through outside of this book, the reading experience of this book, which in many ways is difficult to attribute to the book itself, but at the same time I can attribute to the book itself because the book itself was almost fucking impenetrable without it. It's like a pro and a con. Like on the con side of things, like I said, the book really does expect you to know and understand these names and these figures and these places, which in essence is fine. Like it's a French book. It wasn't written for non-French people, and certainly to expect your reader, what would be obvious to a Frenchman when you translate it into another language. How you want to handle that in translation, I see both sides of the argument. So I'm not going to necessarily take away points for that. It just definitely deserves note. But at the same time, it certainly creates a situation where so much of it is going to be lost if you don't have background knowledge. And especially just this whole idea of whether it's a satire or not. Like, what's the joke? What's the humor? I don't quite get it, again, outside of like these little references to Houllebecq constantly referencing himself as author of this, author of that, and where the book comes up. But one thing that I would call a con is kind of the pacing of the book, because it's weird, takes a weird swing in the third part into being almost a police procedural for about 40 pages. Funnily very critical of police procedurals, but it takes that sort of swing and goes that way for a while. Jed completely disappears from the picture, and inevitably he's going to come back in. And then he comes back in, and there's like 2 more chapters, very short chapters, so like 10 pages of this sort of police procedural thing, and then it just ends. It gets wrapped up, and we move on from there. We're back with Jed for a little bit, and then we get into the epilogue where we just kind of see the rest of Jed's life. So it's very, very odd, that sort of pacing style to me. Another thing that I think I can't say if it's a pro or a con, but the book was written in 2010, but goes on to make commentary and predictions on things that would happen in 2020 and beyond. And now that we're living in those times, I'm definitely curious how those panned out. That sort of some of the predictions he made about the way that France would go, where France's economy would be, and how things would play out. So I'm curious, but again, not knowing shit about France. And by France, I mean not just like, yeah, I know that like the French Revolution happened, but I'm talking like actual getting into the history of France up to like the contemporary age. I don't know anything. So it's just such a difficult book to comment on. And now I'm going to go into spoilers from here on out and talk about themes, because there are things that I liked, but it's difficult for me to talk about them without getting into spoilers. So from here on out, spoilers. So the things that I liked about the book, I already mentioned the theme of decay. And I feel that this is represented both by the fact that his father was a very successful man, but then someday was sort of forced to step down and was kind of humiliated. He went from being a type of person who led people to the type of person who can't even control his own anus. He talks about multiple times needing an artificial anus. And that humiliation of going from big and strong to frail and weak, and his relationship with his son being so damaged in the sense that he was always too busy to ever form a real solid relationship with his son. But at the same time, come his end, it was the only thing that he had. And the struggles with the relationships is something that really defines all of the characters in the books, and something that I think really ends up defining a lot of Houllebecq's work in general. And it's something that I think he does capture well, because there is that not isolationism, not lonerism, introversion, the difficulty to connect with others that makes people fiercely alone in their lives. You have Jeb, who at the end of the book is completely and utterly alone and lives out the rest of his days alone. And while Houllebecq would certainly seem to not consider this the sort of worst end or the miserable end that I think a lot of people would, there's also, because, I don't get the impression that Jeb is necessarily miserable. There's also Olga, who loved him very much, and which he ultimately, through his own insecurities, was unable to forge a relationship with. And I personally just find it difficult to imagine that he wouldn't have had a happier existence had he been able to get over himself and connect with her properly. But really, he's not the type of person who is ever able to really connect fundamentally with a human being, which is why I find his relationship with Houllebecq interesting, Houllebecq the character, and why I wonder if Jeb is not also a kind of reflection of Houllebecq the human being, because they have in common their isolationism. They both say that they see the world the same way, and in the end, they both die alone, attracted really mostly by pets and nature. But it's not just Jeb. The inspector in the book, who arrives in the third part, also can't have... Okay, there's Jeb. There's Jeb's father. I already mentioned his rise, but I should also mention that his wife committed suicide. So that there's that kind of loneliness and failure to connect on a relationship level. There's Jeb and his failure to connect on with Olga. But there's also the one police inspector who has an interesting relationship with his wife, insofar as, because his parents divorced, and it was such a messy divorce, he is never able to marry his significant other, which is fine in the sense that, they're happy together, but it's also the way it's kind of written suggests that there's not... How do I say this? It just comes across to me like there's a distance between them that is mostly due to the past and his specific relationship with his parents, because for all intents and purposes they're happy from the outside, and I do think that they're happy, that they have reached a state of happiness, but whether or not they could be more happy if they could be more honest with each other, if they weren't so defined sort of by their past traumas, is something completely different. And I don't know if this is necessarily what the book is going for, or what Houllebecq is going for, or just what I'm reading out of these characters. Because it's not like the book is really explicit about it one way or the other, but it's just such a recurring theme that nobody in this book... there isn't one character who's just in a happy relationship or a happy marriage, living out their lives, fairly happily with their partner. It just doesn't exist. Everybody in this book has some kind of massive family problem that is almost always defined by some other family problem, with their parents or something like that, which I think is really interesting. And it's hard for me to say if it's well done or not, because it's hard to know if it's intentional or not, or if this is just Houllebecq presenting what he sees as a perfect situation or a fine situation, and which I'm reading as something deeply problematic. Another thing that I think sort of reflects, I mentioned the decay thing, but also the way it talks about kind of art and the decay of art over time, being paralleled by his final, Jeb's final picture work, his final, portfolio pieces, projects, that's the word, projects, being long shots taken over time of nature, and then technology, and nature overlaid with technology in the way that sort of technology rises up and then fades back into nature, being a sort of commentary. And it even says this at the very end of the book, so this part I know I'm not reading into, of how nature kind of comes back and reclaims everything. We kind of rise and from dust and return to dust. And that's reflected again just in these legacies, in the way that his father rose from the middle class to the upper class. He himself rose up even higher, and yet at the end of the book, it all kind of amounts to very little, and he lives, again, the rest of his life in just this complete isolation, which ostensibly makes him content. But I don't know. It's difficult for me to read that and imagine that person as being a fundamentally content person. And this is coming from somebody who is very introverted, who doesn't particularly like going out and spending a lot of time around other people, and who does spend their weekends pretty much exclusively indoors, reading, writing, and playing games or listening to music and whatnot. So for me to make these observations is not, at least I don't feel, just coming from a place of expecting them to conform to some type of broader form of happiness, so much as this type of isolationist existence seems too common across too many characters to be anything other than a kind of sad tragedy, is the way that I kind of see it. And there's other things that I could say about this book, but at the same time, I just feel like I would end up circling back to a lot of I don't know, or I didn't get it, which is where I come away with a lot of I was really hoping that this would cement my feelings on Houllebecq as either an author worth continuing or an author that isn't worth continuing, because like I said with Atomized, I don't remember much about it, but I remember that point about the absence of spirituality very well. Whatever I thought was just bleh. So this was going to be the make or break book, and I just came out smack dab in the center of just, there are things I liked about it and there are things I didn't like about it, but at the end of the day, I didn't get it. It's just way too much that went over my head to feel like I fully understood it, and the reading experience of it was extremely challenging due to just all these outside considerations constantly finding their way into it, which made what is really a very short book, it's only 290 pages, take such a long time to get through, because it was so difficult to focus on what the book was actually saying and not be distracted by all these other things. So putting that aside for now, I will probably read another Houllebecq, but we'll see what happens between now and when I leave Japan. Next up is In the House of the Spirits, and we'll God, well, I'm looking forward to that. That'll be its own can of worms. Woo!